I have many people in my life and in my family who cannot process their fear of death without religion.
You should submit to Allah. Allah as interpreted by who? Totalitarian, misogynistic mullahs. How about no? I don't buy your Allah.
You know, I'm not a religious person, but it's clear to me that with the death of God, you end up in a position where a lot of people lack meaning. And of course, you've got all sorts of other economic disincentives for people to have meaning. It's harder to start a family. People are deferring it until a later point. I myself, you know, I just turned 40 and we had our first child only a year ago, less than a year ago. So a lot of young people are in that position now. And it's having that experience that changes you. It makes you more responsible. It forces you to take on responsibility. It also forces you to look at the world in a different way. So that, I think, is part of the vision. You know, talking about family is difficult because, again, you get to the normative position where it's like you must have children, which is not what I'm saying at all. But again, I think if you start from the incentive point of view, my experience of life is that people respond first and foremost to the incentives that are in front of them. And if you lack meaning, if you don't know what to do with your life, then finding an intimate partner and having a family is going to be a big part of that, in addition to meaningful work, etc.
So I think the problem with the skepticism that you're expressing in relationship to the religious enterprise is that it doesn't sufficiently separate the wheat from the chaff.
I see what you're saying, but we're not disagreeing, because let me take you back to the beginning of this conversation when I did say to you that I believe religion is useful, right? And I'm fond of, I can't remember who said this, but someone said that the poor believe religion is true, the middle class believes it's false, and the rich believe it's useful, or the powerful believe it's useful. I'm not powerful or rich, but I certainly consider it useful, and I can see that the lack of it has its negative impact as well. I just don't wish to submit myself to a rigid ideology of that kind, combined with the fact I don't believe in the big guy in the sky, right?
Okay, so let's not make it, okay, so let's agree that you shouldn't subordinate yourself arbitrarily to a rigid structure. Now, you might want to do that sporadically to discipline yourself, right? But the object shouldn't be submission. Now, what's weird in the biblical narrative, you know, is that the goal is not submission. It's so weird. It's covenantal relationship. And covenantal relationship is actually relationship. So one of the things you see with Moses, for example, and you also see this with Abraham, is that they're constantly negotiating with God. That's why the name of my next book, by the way, is We Who Wrestle with God. It's a negotiation. It's not a submission. And so God is always threatening to wipe out the Israelites in the desert. He's just sick and tired of their idol worship and their whiny resentment and their bitterness and their worship of the past tyranny. And he's constantly threatening just to wipe them out and start again. And that's the apocalypse, I suppose. And Moses is constantly interceding on their behalf and telling God he shouldn't break his word. And the odd thing in the story is that God actually listens, which is rather preposterous. But the reason that's happening is to mitigate against exactly the problem that you described, which is to have the relationship with the transcendent degenerate into nothing but a blind obedience. And then the danger of that is, well, a blind obedience to who? And I see this as a threat in Islam, in the more fundamentalist forms of Islam. It's like, well, you should submit to Allah. It's like, hey, fair enough. Allah as interpreted by who? Oh, totalitarian, misogynistic mullahs. How about no? I don't buy your Allah. And I don't see who made you the right, precisely.
And even if I believed in the bearded guy in the sky, I'm not sure I need a middleman to talk to him. Right?
Well, that makes you a good Protestant. You know?
Well,
but look, we could also go down that rabbit hole a little bit, you know, and it's worth it, because I also think this is how we ended up in this postmodern excess liberal conundrum. So Jung talked about Catholicism, as we mentioned, and he talked about the utility of and mercy of the confessional and that possibility of atonement. But he also laid out, you know, the dangers of that. The dangers of the Catholic structure is, what would you say, a tilt towards authoritarian rigidity, which is what the Protestants rebelled against. But then the question is, well, what's the danger of the Protestant Revolution? And the danger is that everybody becomes his own church. And then here's the problem. You tell me what you think about this. Here's the logical conclusion of that. You're your own church. You're your own God. Now you can say what God said to Moses out of the depths of the burning bush. You can say, I am what I am. And I would say that's what the identity politics types do. They say, look, I am so superordinate in my own self-defining identity that no matter what identity claim I put forward, it is incumbent upon you to accept it as if it comes from an omniscient source. And I think, as far as I can tell, Constantine, that's where we are, right? Increasingly by force of law.
If I look at what you're saying, then, are you suggesting that we need God to agree on truth?
I'm saying is that spirit which would enable us to agree on truth is, for all intents and purposes, equivalent to God, and necessarily so.
So without that, we cannot agree on what the truth is.
Well, the metaphysic that unites us has to be grounded in something that isn't merely political and semantic. That's the right way of thinking about it. There has to be something transcendental about it, akin to that experience you had
of connection to all humanity. Yes.
Okay, now look, Sam Harris thinks the same thing, which is why he's off in meditative space half the time, right? He has an unnameable God because then his semantic brain can't tear it to shreds. He understands that it's necessary to dip into the realm of the transcendent sporadically in order to renew yourself. And he'll say, well, that's not religious. It's like, well, it's not totalitarian and it's not systematic. But that doesn't mean it's not religious. And then Harris, of course, his approach falls prey to the same problem as a kind of abstract Buddhism, which is, yeah, well, that's all well and good on the transcendental front, but how do you make that manifest in life, and how do you unite other people in that ethos? And that's a practical problem, and you need intermediary structures to do that.
Well, that's why I think religion is useful for uniting most people, because my experience is they need it. I have many people in my life and in my family who cannot process their fear of death without religion. They just can't deal with it. And they all mask it and they all kind of deal with it in one way or another. But it is having the sense of something above them in that particular way that gives them the comfort to live their life. And there are other people who maybe don't need it. I certainly don't. I enjoy my life. I know I'm going to die. I know that my life this is my experience and my view. My life only has the meaning that I give to it. And I get to choose that. Now, that puts in question the nature of morality. I appreciate that. And for society, there has to be a structure that gives you a sense of morality which is why I say religion is useful. But for me personally, it's not.